You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Here with another paper to read tonight. And I'll tell you who this paper was inspired by in just a moment. Before I get into the paper, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. You guys should like and subscribe to their YouTube channel. But there are other shows on the podcast network you should be checking out.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Also, check out the Queen's Council Podcast, another show on KWAZ Radio. I want to thank everyone who's listening to me live right now. I don't know who is, but if you're here, I appreciate you. I know that the Nets are playing Brooklyn tonight, and I realized that a lot of folks weren't live with me. I guess you guys are checking out the playoffs. That's all good. I'm not going to complain. I know the weather's getting good as well in the Northeast, for example, and I know that COVID restrictions are starting to get roll back or whatever. So I guess folks may be outside enjoying life and doing what they got to do. I can't be mad at that. So this paper tonight is called What African Names May or May Not Tell Us About the State of Pan-Africanism. I was inspired to do this topic because of one Kwame Brown. Kwame Brown is a former NBA player, former #1 draft pick, drafted by Jordan's team. And apparently Jordan was very hard. By the way, he came straight out of high school, so kudos to that brother. Jordan was very hard on him in the beginning, and I guess he lost his confidence. And a lot of people have called him a bust. Well, his name came out of the blue recently. I guess some NBA players, former NBA players, were bringing his name up again, and he took offense to it. He's been out of the league now for like 8 years, and he had a 12-year career. So him being a bust, if he is indeed a bust, is a little bit old right now. But he got back at him. He talked his shit too. But the problem with a lot of these guys, because they're not fully immersed in consciousness and what have you, these guys eventually say some dumb shit. So what's the dumb shit that Kwame, now remember his name now, what's the dumb shit that Kwame Brown had to say, right? Let's see if I can get this pulled up here. Right, let's see if I can get this playing.
I just had the dumbest text conversation I had in a long time. Somebody with a degree trying to tell me something. She African American. I'm an American. Not gonna trick me with that shit. That's what they want you to think. You ain't American. Motherfucker, if my ancestors helped build this son of a bitch, why would I say I'm African? I never been to Africa. I ain't African American. I'm a fucking American. This is crazy. You live by the laws of America, but you can keep associating yourself with Africa. Africans don't like you. Nigerians don't like you. They taught and trained when they come over here, they don't fuck with you. So you can keep with that pipe dream. But there's so many people trying to take everything I say out of context because they don't want to deal with what was actually said. They don't want to deal with the truth. A lot of people like to separate and divide people because she don't want to deal with the truth. She don't want to deal with the fact that she keep talking about, you said welfare and Trump in the same sentence. No, what I said was there was a lot of our women, our people, because that's my women, I'm black, in a line when they shut down the government. You can't even take your time to, let's drop the emotion. Oh, he said niggas. Oh, it has a negative connotation. Well, stop. I bet I never hear you listening to a song that say nigga in it. Don't try that with me. Your little fake education, what they taught you is not going to work with me. I'm a free thinker. That's not going to work. You're not an African American. Them motherfuckers go to Africa and get caught after dark. You know, motherfucking Africa. You visited Africa. The fuck is you talking about? Half you motherfuckers ain't been on a plane. Tell me you African American. Somebody told you that. Someone told you that. African American. When all the Africans come over here, don't complain, don't do none, all ghetto gaggers. Where they saying you're a nigga right there while they fucking you. Come on, man. Please stop. Stop playing with me. Y'all motherfuckers don't ever want to hear the honest truth. That's why so many people are afraid to tell you duck ass.
And there it is. This Negro, this big 6'11" Negro named Kwame, is an African. By the way, Kwame Brown's background is that he's from the Gullah Geechee people. The Gullah Geechee people, in case you don't know, are, when you talk about Black American or Africans in America, they are the group of people who have retained their African culture, their Africanness, probably the most, even more than folks down in Louisiana. All right. As Great House said on Twitter, clearly his parents think he's African because they named him Kwame. But this is the problem when these folks get to listening to the wrong people. So this paper I'm going to read is kind of lengthy, and I know folks are watching the playoffs and whatnot, but this paper is dedicated to Kwame Brown. Right? Get your minds right. Listen to the right stuff. First, if you dissect what he said earlier, he said some educated person. So he's anti-educated people. So he's just going off of anecdotes and all that shit. That's what he's cool with. This educated person is trying to give him some info, and he prefer listen to. Clearly, he's listening to the ADOS, the FBA, the Tariq Nasheeds, the Yvette Carnells, and that like. Negro, your name is Kwame. Did you guys like the thumbnail for this episode, by the way? Right? You're likely named after Kwame Nkrumah. As Revolutionary Matron says, he's lost. KW Don 7 is saying Kwame Brown is another weaponized black entertainer. He also says Kwame Brown's NBA career was a total bust. Jerry Wallace is here saying, what's good, family? What's good with Jerry? Revolutionary Matron says, greetings to everyone to start. All right? So this is what this big 6'11" fool, right, is talking about. Let's get into the paper. What African names may or may not tell us about the state of Pan-Africanism. This paper is by Obadeli, Kambon, and Roland, Mireku, Yeboah. Now, if you guys remember, I had Kambon as a guest on the show before, right? So the abstract reads, names are important to African, which equals black people of the continent and diaspora, as traditionally one's name is seen as playing a crucial role in the fulfillment or lack thereof of one's life purpose. However, due to enslavement and neo-enslavement in the diaspora, as well as colonialism and neo-colonialism on the continent, many African black people now give their children the names of their enslavers or colonial enemies. In this article, we utilize a comparative anthroponymic analysis, making use of case studies from two institutions, namely the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana at Legon, and Abibitumi Casa, with locations in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Accra, Ghana, in order to observe how some African, which equals black people, adopt Eurasian names and or reclaim African names, as well as the form such names take. In our findings, we observed that in the case of names from Abibitumi Casa pulling largely from the diaspora, African or black individuals tend to have names from all over the African world, whereby the first name may be from one cultural linguistic group, while the surname is from another. There also may be a disparity whereby a preferred African or black name may be different from one's legal name, which may still be Eurasian. In the case of IAS, which is the Institute of African Studies, we find that names tend to be either from colonial enemies, a single African cultural linguistic group, or a mixture of these two. In conclusion, we argue that these tendencies of the continent and the diaspora, as represented by these two African black institutions, may serve as a litmus test for understanding the current state of Pan-Africanism. So if you remember, Obadeli studies the Medu Neter. You see, they start off with this imagery, these glyphs that basically say, look, your name will exist forever in the temple of the Neter. Look, your name will exist forever in the temple of the Neter. So let's do the introduction and background. Again, I want to thank everyone who's here with me live today. I appreciate you guys. This study was sparked by a conversation at the annual conference of the Linguistics Association of Ghana in 2013 at the University of Cape Coast. In the context of an informal conversion after one of the sessions, a Ghanaian colleague remarked to the first author of this article that Africans of the diaspora have an odd practice of changing their names and randomly picking one African name from, say, East Africa and another name from somewhere on the other side of the continent. In the ensuing conversation, I reflected upon an observation I had made previously in terms of an even more marked practice whereby Ghanaians will have one African name with another British, German, Dutch, or Hebrew name from somewhere on the other side of the world. I further reflected upon this discussion, and I consider that many Ghanaians have the assumption that Africans of the diaspora with African names must have necessarily changed their names, neglecting the fact that many are born with African names due to the African consciousness of their parents, Kwame Brown. On the other side, many Africans of the diaspora are completely unaware that there are continental Africans who have Eurasian first and last names and who have never had any African name whatsoever due to factors such as historical circumstances and or anti-African consciousness, Eurasian religions, or missionary schools. More profoundly, there seems to be a major gap in the literature in that studies on Akan names, Yoruba names, and onomastics, anthroponymy of African cultural linguistic groups tend to focus on wholly indigenous names, and how naming was done traditionally 100, 200 or more years ago before the massive incursion of Eurasian cultural imperialism disguised as universalism. Many of these studies do not take into account that there are many Africans who self-identify as ethnically Akan, Yoruba, Gikuyu, Zulu, Vai, Mandika, and many others who do not bear African names in content, form, structure, origin, or meaning. In some places, even when an African name is used, it may be only in the context of the household, while in public, a Eurasian name is preferred and used. This study therefore hopes to fill a significant gap in the literature in terms of what names are Africans of the continent and the diaspora giving ourselves and our children as one of many potentially significant indicators in terms of the current state of Pan-Africanism. This study also aims to fill a gap in terms of comparative onomastics by means of synchronically comparing and contrasting African naming practices of the continent and the diaspora via an ambitious pilot study targeting two specific institutions whose stakeholder bases are overwhelmingly biogenetically African or Black. As such, in this study, we will look at the names of Africans belonging to two different institutions and ponder the implications of these names. Various proverbs, idioms, and other primary sources speak to the significance of names for African people. In the concept of destiny, as found in African languages such as Akan and Yoruba, known as Krabia, or in Krabia, and Akin Layan, respectively, the name is seen as playing a significant role in its fulfillment or lack thereof, right? So the belief basically is you're naming a child, right, names their destiny, essentially, right? Naming a child essentially, what's the word? Manifests. They're supposed to manifest their destiny. According to Mazama in 2018, destiny can be redefined by one's oppressors through renaming an individual or group, thereby depriving African Black people of the strength, power, and structuring meanings derived from our culture, and by causing us to give up our African agency. And that there's some truth to that. Remember, I always talk about it on the show, and you guys have said it to me as well. Some of you have said it to me that there's power in naming things. There's power in naming things, right? Those names are important to African people of the continent and the diaspora, mainly because they interact with or they have an impact on one's life and purpose, and this is an African thought. This concept can be seen in the Yoruba proverb, one's name affects one's character, one's war name determines how one behaves. However, due to enslavement, neo-enslavement, colonialism, and neocolonialism, oftentimes these days Africans give their children names of their Eurasian enemies, including but not limited to white Americans, Arabs, Israelis, British, French, Belgians, Afrikaners, Dutch, Germans, Portuguese, Russians, and Indo-Aryans. In this article, we utilize a comparative anthroponymic human name analysis, making use of case studies from two institutions, the IAS and Abibitumi Casa, in order to observe how some African Black people adopt Eurasian names and or retain or reclaim African names and the form such names take. So this brings us to a section called African Names as Conceptualized in Traditional African Proverbs and Reflections. According to Akanaso in 1980, the basic purpose of naming is to provide a symbolic system of individual identification. Like every aspect of culture, such a symbolic system is usually historically constructed, socially maintained, and based on shared assumptions and expectations of members of a particular community. Thus, for Akanaso, the basic function of naming is to serve as a system of individual identification. This idea is encapsulated in the proverb. It is, why don't they have a, I hate when they do that. They don't have it's stupid. It is because of the day a child will commit an offense that he or she has his own name. Okay, so I guess that is the translation. Okay, it is because of the day a child will commit an offense that he or she has his own name. For example, each person has a name which will be used to identify him or her whenever there is a problem. The same concept is found in the Afrikan proverb, which is the supreme being doesn't like badness, so he or she gave names one by one, right? Or this other one that says because of badness, names are given. Mambo Ama Mazama in 2018 gives a tripartite function of names as incorporating A, the integrative social functions of names, B, the spiritual alignment function of names to seal and reveal one's destiny, and C, the psychological function which lets the child or world know how the name giver sees the child and what is expected of the child. Quick question for you guys listening. If you have children, or if you don't have children but intend to have children in the future, will you be giving your children Afrocentric names? And by Afrocentric, I mean of the continent, not, you know how some black folks give their children some name that sounds like it could be kind of African, but it's not. It's like a made-up name, right? Are you guys gonna give your kids, if you don't have any, authentic African names, given the opportunity? To continue, additionally, in the African context, the construction of personal names may demonstrate lexical, phonological, morphological, syntactic, and pragmatic considerations relative to the cultural linguistic group from which the name is derived. For Obeng in 2001, African names provide channels that speak for and about their societies. Worth quoting at length, he states that names are used to achieve a number of goals, including showing human relationships and social roles, revealing Africans' quest for truth and meaning in life, showing the polarity, for example, goodness and badness in human behavior, pointing to the name users, name givers or name bearers, hopes, dreams, and aspirations, showing Africans' perception of cosmic elements like the sun, moon, wind, and rain, and many others. African names may reflect the name user's geographical environment, as well as their fears, religious beliefs, and philosophies of life and death. Children's names may even provide insights into important cultural or socio-political events at the time of their birth. Now, before I continue, I want to point out something. I mentioned this on an episode in the past. Africans who were enslaved in America after emancipation, there was a period of time where Africans carried on the culture that you find in a lot of West African countries of naming their children after days of the week, right? So in the Akan, a guy like Kwame Brown is named because he was born on a Wednesday, right? The female counterpart to his name is Ama, A-M-A, meaning she was born on a Wednesday, right? So the African way of naming usually had a male and a female, and it's not uncommon, like they're saying in this paper, for the name to serve some purpose or some preferred destiny, or they're named from the day that they were born, right? They're named after they were born. So that's why you go back in Africans in America's history, you see that sometimes they name children Tuesday, they name them Friday. You know, that's carrying on that tradition, right? But they're doing it in an Anglophone type way, right? In the chat room, KW7 says, when you reverse engineer Kwame Brown's videos, he has black conservative talking points, much like Jesse Lee Peterson and Larry Elder. So I haven't watched a lot of his videos. The first set of videos that he came out with, where he was going back at the dudes who were clowning him, I appreciated those videos because finally he stood up for himself. I felt bad for him back in the day during his career, and people was clowning him all the time. Stephen A. Smith clowning his name and all that kind of stuff. But Stephen A. Smith should be ashamed of himself too, right? That's an African name. Don't clown it, right? talk about his poor play or whatever, but don't clown his name, right? But I haven't listened to a whole lot of his videos outside of that, and outside of the one I just played earlier, right? But I'm not surprised that he has those type of people's talking points, because I heard people say now he's on the coon train. Revolutionary Matron says we name our children after the enemy and wonder why we at war with our children. That's a great point. I'll tell you something else too. When your children show up in school or show up around folks, and there's a blackety black child with the name of, let me be careful what name I throw out here, with the name of Godfrey or some shit like that, right? Your enemies are quietly watching you and clowning you. KW7 says many black people still want to name their children to fit with Yoruba. I agree. Revolution Matron says it would be nice to name them with a family name to identify them with the group as a ritual and a public name for use with the colonial world. KW7 says, I intend to give my children authentic African names. Kudos to you, brother. Revolution Matron says people were also named after months like April, May. Right, that's absolutely correct. In fact, that's a better example than what I use. You're absolutely correct. Right? It was not uncommon post-emancipation, I want to say up until like the civil rights movement. Wasn't uncommon for children, black people, to name their children after the months as well. I said days of the week, but also the months. April, May, June, August. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, absolutely right. You know, that's a good inclusion there. Not just days of the week, but months. And you call off the proper months at April, May, and June, and August. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. All right. To continue, Seiko in 2006 echoes this sentiment, noting that this phenomenon is not limited to the Yoruba, stating that among Africans, names reflected the worldview of a people. Hence, some names are used to accentuate and situate the significance of an experience, an event, or phenomenon. Speaking with regard to the Yoruba socio-cultural context specifically, Oduyoye in 1972 avers that, quote, virtually every name has an extant meaning, end of quote. For Johnson in 1966, African names express, quote, what the child is, or what he or she is hoped to become, end of quote. A similar view is demonstrated in an interview by Obeng in 2001, wherein the Akan interviewee stated, just as one leads an unproductive life if one is named sit in a country do nothing, or one's life is riddled with deaths, funerals, if one is named she or he went to a funeral, so does one have good luck and abundance if one is named he came at a good time. This quote basically conveys the essential idea that African black names are thought to have an influence on one's life path and destination. A similar sentiment is expressed in the following Yoruba Proverbs. 1. A child's name is his or her bridle. 2. A child is influenced by his or her name. That's a fact. 3. A child gets used to behaving like his or her name. 4. The child of the wood dealer who sells wood's bark is influenced by his or her name. Now, I want to say this too. It was also an African thing to name your children after your ancestors. And what I noticed that happened is that a lot of folks, because they started taking on these Anglo names, these Yoruba names, they ended up naming their children after their brother, after their uncle, who had a Yoruba name. Right? I've known folks who were named Wilfred because they had an uncle named Wilfred. You feel me? And so that is the perversion of what is an African practice. Because we took on these names and never reverted back, we end up naming our children, grandchildren, grandnieces, and whatnot after folks who were given these Anglo or Yoruba names, and that's something we got to change, right? But even that, even though the name is messed up because it's a Yoruba name, it's still a part of the African practice to name your children after some ancestor, particularly a recent ancestor. And I grew up in a family like that. Right? Revolutionary Matron says there's been so much degradation of African culture. Oftentimes our people did not have the confidence in Africanness to name their children with an African name. Names were also given to add prestige, like Queen Victoria, yeah, Margaret and Charles and all that old shit, right? You know, that's our history. And sometimes we use a kind of syncretism to carry on an African culture, but the problem is we carried it on, the African naming culture, we carried it on with Yoruba names, right? Which is not helpful. By the way, you remember Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, changed his last name to Malcolm X? How many of you have ever considered that? I had a sister on the show some years ago, Natasha. Natasha's surname is one thing, but she tends to go by Natasha X. How many of you would consider changing your name, if not to an African one, which is preferred? Would you just go with the X surname? A similar proverb in Kiswahili may indeed serve as a relevant conceptual framework for understanding the current state of Pan-Africanism. Quote, if you inherit a name, you must adopt its affairs. I like that. That's the power in naming things, right? If you name your children, if you name your child asshole, what do you expect the little asshole to do? But be nothing but asshole. There's power in names. You have to, because children don't name themselves, you have to give them that power, right? So for example, Kwame Brown, whether you like the guy I'm going to mention next or not, if Kwame Brown was following, especially coming from the people that he came from, the Geechee people, as I mentioned before, if he had sense, he would have looked into his name. He would have tried to figure out, who is Kwame? What Kwame am I named after? Nkrumah? Was I named Kwame because I was born on a Wednesday? Like and that could, if he was using his head, that would lead him down a path. You feel me? If he was using his head, that would lead him down a certain path. So the names are very, very important, right? That is to say, those with African, non-African, or anti-African names may indeed adopt African, non-African, and anti-African affairs on the basis of the names that they bear, particularly with regard to engaging in Pan-African naming practices or not. In particular, and that last line right there, Pan-African naming practices, that's something that we need to pick up. In articulation of the connection between the circumstances of a child's birth and the name that he or she may bear, it is stated that my grandmother used to call me Ama, I can't pronounce that last name, which means Saturday born female person. Okay, so maybe it's Saturday born. I said Wednesday, maybe it's Saturday born, I'm sorry. Saturday born female person who went to a funeral. Or actually, yeah, right. Because I was born on Saturday, the day on which the big chief passed away. However, the people in our neighborhood call me Ama Dapper because that day was Holy Saturday, right? Right, it's born on Saturday. I said Wednesday. I don't know why I said Wednesday. It's born on Saturday. I think KWAZ is born on Friday. Someone tell me if I'm right or wrong about KWAZ. Right? But Kwame is born on Saturday. A Yoruba proverb that speaks to this issue is, quote, the home is what we look at before we name a child. For example, a child is named according to the circumstances of the home. In a similar quote with regard to birth circumstances, an interviewee says, at home, everyone calls him male born on Saturday at dawn, or male born on Saturday in the dry season, because he was born on Saturday at dawn during the dry season. Right? And by the way, his name, if you look up here, is Kwame Hema. Right? At home, everyone calls him male born on Saturday at dawn, or male born on Saturday in the dry season, because he was born on Saturday at dawn during the dry season. Thus, African names constitute an integral part of human existence, as they can be instruments of arousing, defining, manifesting, and establishing the expectations, aspirations, and consciousness of the bearers. A proverb that demonstrates this idea is found below. Let me see if I can find it now. We name a child Sore, he went to Ebi and returned. We name a child Sobo, he went on a journey and returned. We now name a child Sorinlo, he went on a journey and never returned. We are expecting him. Who does not know that the child takes the name of never returned from home? Demonstrating that the name of a person can, in a sense, be a platform for the destiny of the bearer, thus providing an explanation for the bearer's behavior. So important were or are names considered to be by African Black people that even during life, people could be essentially deprived of existence by banning their names. For example, a man named Mentu Hotep, who had been banished from society, could be referred to as he who is separate from the name Mentu Hotep. So this brings us to a section called Politicization of African names. Beyond these aspects of African naming, names may also be political, both in terms of content and the circumstances surrounding them. According to Mazama in 2009, the naming process reflects a deeper issue of self-definition, which is inherently political, particularly in the context of neo-enslavement and neo-colonialism. According to Azania, 1988, cited in Akwamu, 2004, the first step in one's struggle for freedom, or free mind, is the naming of oneself, with the best names that identify with the best of one's, I guess that means glorious past. Rejecting the slave name, protesting against it, is actually defying it. This marks a place where a substantial step towards self-determination is made, right? He goes on to argue that to destroy something is to call it by any name you see fit. However the case may be, whole nations have been destabilized, disrupted, put into social confusion, brainwashed, misdirected, deprived of food, and renamed after they were conquered. The power to educate and train people to uplift themselves on one hand, and to tear down and destroy somebody else on the other, is a power game to name. All right? There's a couple of African nations that renamed themselves after they got the colonial powers off them. I think Zimbabwe is one, right? Formerly Rhodesia, I think it was named after Cecil Rhodes, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't Zimbabwe one of those folks who went back to their original name? Who else went back to their original name once they got the colonizers out of their space? All right. Revolutionary Matron says, as we talk, I want to give my children African names and force people to say the name correctly instead of acquiesce to their identity. There was a show I used to check out on Netflix called Orange is the New Black. And on there, they had a sister who's, her character was crazy. And I forgot her name now. It's a shame I did. But she told a story once in an interview, and I really appreciated it. She said she hated her name growing up, all right? And she asked her mother if she could change her name. And the mom said, why do you want to change your name? She said, it's an ugly name, I hate it. People can't pronounce it correctly. And the mother said, listen, if these white folks could say Wagner and Dostoevsky and all this type of shit, they could say your name. If they could say this old shit that's, all kinds of Russian and German and all that, if they could say that shit, they could pronounce your name correctly. And that came to mind when I read Revolutionary Matron's comment, right? Don't shy away from the name, right? If you teach your kids to shy away from their name, you're teaching them to shy away from their destiny, from their history, all of it. Don't teach your kids to shy away from their name. So this process is referred to by Mazama in 2018 as the double process of cultural suppression and conversion, which encompasses the obliteration of the original identity by denying one's African name and the severance of ties with original self-governing community through denaming and renaming. Remember, in Roots, there's a whole scene where they're beating this brother Kunta Kinte, and they're beating into him a name change. Ask yourself, why is that? What did these Yurugu understand about beating the African name out of a person? And that's where you gotta throw Kwame Brown and them in the trash. That's why you have to throw that type of dude in the garbage. If you didn't throw him there already from his playing days, throw him there today. This brings us to a section called African Names and Pan-Africanism. We can examine traditional African Black names and their role in recording history and birth circumstances, and also in terms of proverbial, political, survival, hypochoristic, spiritual, or divination names, and so on. To this, we can add the more overtly political aspect of naming and asserting one's identity, and as a form of resistance against oppression and conversion. A related consideration relates to the name that one gives one's child or receives from one's family or community, and how that process is political. This naming process relates to what one truly owns or what belongs to a person. 3 evaluative criteria can also be considered with regard to Pan-Africanism, which can be thought of in terms of the 3 R's. Number 1, how it relates. 2, how it is relative. And 3, how it is relevant. Relates, relative, relevant. In the context of names, we can ask, how does a name relate to Pan-Africanism? How is it relative and how is it relevant? In this study, we will look at the different naming patterns. We will look at what different naming patterns may tell us about the state of Pan-Africanism. In its initial conception, the agenda set for the Pan-Africanism movement by its founders and the coiners of the term Pan-Africanism itself contains the following projects. 1, promote unity, feeling, and friendly intercourse among the peoples of the Negro African race. 2, to achieve self-rule with civil rights and responsible Black governments for colonized Negro countries. 3, to achieve voting rights, physical security, prosperity, progress, and justice for Africans abroad, or Negroes in the countries of the white race. 4, to promote the business interests of Africans abroad, like African people living in the countries of the whites. 5, to create a great central Negro state in Africa for the Black race. 6, to secure integrity and independence for self-governing Negro countries like Ethiopia, Haiti, Liberia, and any others that emerge. And 7, to earn for the Negro race equality with and respect of the other races of humanity. Although, of course, naming was not an explicit objective of Pan-Africanism, it fits in with core goals related in self-determination. This is expressed by Mambo, or Professor Mazama, as the first act of agency. I don't know why I'm stuttering so much tonight. Thus, naming is certainly in alignment with the spirit of Pan-Africanism in its original conception. This begs the question of how much do we buy into Pan-African agency and self-determination as expressed through the names we call ourselves and that we give to our children. More specifically, while Pan-Africanism may be included under goals, hopes, dreams, aspirations, philosophies of life, or political anthroponyms, at this juncture, it may be useful to develop a test of sorts to assess how a name relates, is relative, and or relevant to Pan-Africanism. Such an assessment may involve A, whether a name is indigenous African or not, B, whether a name is restricted to one cultural, linguistic, ethnic group, C, whether or not a name is restricted to one country, and D, the relevance of the name's meaning to Pan-Africanism. Generally speaking, with regard to 3A, which I just read, which is whether the name is indigenous African or not. For example, one may interpret an indigenous African name as being expressive of a more Pan-African tendency than, say, a wholly Eurasian name. By the same token, one may expect a name restricted to one cultural, linguistic, ethnic group to be more expressive of ethnic consciousness than of Pan-African consciousness in any broad sense of the term. That is to say, if one is African, yet the only names that one regards as truly one's own are worth passing to the next generation are Eurasian names, or those that happen to come from one's village, this raises serious questions about how internalized that Pan-African identity actually is. Where the name may transcend ethnic boundaries, a further question may involve whether or not the name extends beyond the artificial neo-colonial Berlin Conference cages, referred to as countries, in which many continental Africans are now located. In other words, where ethnic boundaries are transcended, it may not be due to the intentionality of understanding that all African names are one's own heritage should be passed on, but simply due to the circumstances of having one parent from one group and the other from another group, and each contributing a name reflective of that reality. Such a name may be less conscientiously Pan-African than one that expresses intentionality in terms of self-definition, as one's interested in concrete Pan-African living rather than abstract, theoretical conference room, coffee shop Pan-Africanism, aka Pan-Africanism. That's a good one, Pan-Africanism. I like that. I gotta use that in the future. Right? Pan-Africanism. Furthermore, 3D brings us to the point of how is the actual meaning of one's name relevant and or relative to Pan-Africanism. Does the form, structure, and or content point the child on a particular path of realization? As evinced by Obeng's 2001 typology, such considerations with regard to Pan-Africanism may not be at the forefront of one's mind in terms of name giving in either traditional or modern context. Indeed, our 3 R's, by way of evaluative criteria of relate, relative, and relevant to some degree, impose upon us the question of how does a given name relate to Pan-Africanism with regard to the name's source, the intent behind giving the name, and the behavior that the name may be meant to engender. For example, is the name from a single ethnic group? Is the name one imposed by one's erstwhile colonizer or current neo-colonizer? What is the meaning of the name? And is that meaning designed to tell the child to aspire to Pan-African consciousness, ethnic consciousness, Afropean consciousness, or Eurasian consciousness, among other possibilities? Is the name circumstantial? Does it express Pan-African hopes or aspirations? If the meaning of the name is known at all, If not, then the four considerations with regard to Pan-Africanism as expressed in number 3 will not be evident in the names one gives to one's children. Expressed differently, the question may be posed in terms of what is relevant to you and what do you consider to be part of your history. In terms of ownership, if one is truly African, then what would prohibit one from passing on the names beyond one's cultural linguistic group other than the ethnic, family, clan consciousness trumping a broader Pan-African consciousness? This brings us to the related question of what is appropriation and can you appropriate what is yours? Phrased differently, if one is African, can one appropriate that which is also African? By the way, I don't like when writers say something and then say, phrase differently. I mean, why phrase it one way and then come back and phrase it differently? Just phrase it the way you meant to phrase it. Some would say no more than one can appropriate one's own eyebrows or one's own nose because all of your body parts already belong to you. This is a more prototypically Pan-African view than the restrictive, ethnic, neo-colonial, Afropean consciousness view. If you are African or Black and identify as African Black, does whatever is African or Black, regardless of location, ethnic group, culture, language, time period, belong to you? And if so, how does that more prototypically Pan-African view surface in the important and inherently intimate realm of naming? In other words, again, how is one's thinking embodied in one's life choices, decisions, including but not limited to African or Black and or anti-African, anti-Black naming traditions? We will also explore the question of whether we have African Black consciousness or ethnic fragment consciousness based on where we come from or what we have endured. For example, enslavement or colonization. Is one's consciousness expansive or restricted? We also examine the correlation between one's consciousness and one's behavior with specific reference to naming. These are just some of the considerations that we set out to explore in this article. In lieu of these questions, a pertinent video clip of Professor Theophile Obenga in 2018 discusses the need to build African consciousness rather than tribal consciousness, right? The type of Pan-African consciousness discussed in this video articulates a good point of departure for the topic at hand, which is pertinent to anthroponymic decolonization as a potential indicator of the state of Pan-Africanism as expressed in names as a manifestation of Pan-African consciousness synchronically and diachronically. That's a lot of words. My thing is, give an African name, regardless of if the name has transcended the tribe or the geographical location. Just give an African name. Right? Let's keep it simple like that. I really dislike how they didn't just simplify it like that. But anyway, this brings us to a section called Method, Institutional Sources of Data. So before I talk about the methods, I want to say that if the paper gets too heavy on data and too heavy on statistical analysis, I will skip over that stuff a bit. All right? It's important to know the method that it went about, but if they start talking about, ANOVA and all that kind of statistical analysis, I'm not gonna deal too much in that. We'll just go to the conclusions, right? So the method, institutional sources of data. In this article, we use purposeful sampling methods with the intent of gaining a greater amount of insight into issues related to naming patterns of Africans of the continent and diaspora. As such, our study participants came from two African institutions, which are the IAS and Abibitumi. As far as IAS is concerned, It was a prize to be suitable for this intellectual exercise because the majority of the names are primarily from continental Africa, with 270 students graduating from the institute during the period between 1961 and 2011. Comprising the data which we have available, Abibitumi Casa was also chosen because it represents not only continental Africa, but the global African world. Abibitumi Casa has over 2 million users, and 600,000 are out of the United States. 200,000 are from Ghana, 140,000 are from Nigeria. The rest are distributed around Kenya, the United Kingdom, South Africa, and so on. So the intention was to get some of the data specifically coming from the diaspora. Essentially, we looked at those two institutions due to their overtly African constituency that they serve and due to availability of data across time. So I want to say and remind you guys could look at the screen right now and you can see at the bottom that you can follow me on social media, and included in the social media that you can follow me on is Abibitumi. All right, again, that's Obadel Kambon's social media site that you all should be on. If you can be on Mark Zuckerberg shit, you could be on an African's social media site, right? And if you join Abibitumi, hit me up and, with a follow or whatever they call it. Now, I'll be honest with you. Abibitumi, the only reason why I haven't done some of the things I said I was going to do there, I had a whole show, a whole spin-off show set to do on Abibitumi with Swahili, is because I find the site somewhat difficult to navigate. And that's because you're so used to the social media stuff that Zuckerberg and them have, and Twitters and all that stuff, where it's there's a certain way you navigate those sites, and to me, I don't see how you navigate those sites similarly on Abibitumi. But that's not stopping me from one day sitting down and really trying to figure out how to use the site, how to make the site work for this platform, this podcast platform. But you guys should check out the site. You can connect with Africans on the continent, Africans throughout the diaspora. It's a pretty dope site, except that I just haven't figured out how to properly navigate it and properly use it for the purpose of the podcast, right? So yeah, so you guys can check that. By the way, again, I'm stuttering. How many of you are familiar with the Abibitumi, the social media site? How many of you are on it, as a matter of fact? Let me know that in the comment section. So this brings us to a section of paper called data. As far as IAS is concerned, what we found is that from the time period of 1961 to 2011, of 270 people who completed and graduated from IAS, the majority of such people either of the master's or the PhD level, 155 of them had one African name and one Eurasian name, as shown in Table 1 and Figure 1. An example of this pattern includes John Mensa, where the John is the Eurasian name and the Mensa is the African name. 67 of IAS graduates, which is the second highest total, had names of Eurasians only. Betty Johnson or John Miller, for example. This is followed by 29 who had African-only names, but which came from one specific culture. So if the name is Akan, it is Akan only. If it is Ga, it is Ga only. If it is Iwe, it is Iwe only. And if it is Yoruba, it is Yoruba only. There were also African names coming from different cultures and languages, plus one Eurasian name. So for example, the name may be Eric Odoi Mensa. These are Eurasian, Ga, and Akan, respectively. Interesting. These were 10 in number. Then there were also African names coming from different languages and cultures, but from one country. And this pattern obtained for 6 individuals. The final type is African names coming from different cultures and languages, and also from different countries, which amounted to just 3. The latter is what we see as the most minuscule in terms of crossing these neocolonial boundaries. And this phenomenon was almost non-existent in the IAS data as shown in Table 1 below. And again in Figure 1, we see that over 80% of the data out of those who completed IAS had either African and Eurasian names or only Eurasian names. The third highest percentage is that of Africans coming from only one language or cultural group from one country. The case of Abibitumi Casa is shown in Table 2 and Figure 2. We saw African and Eurasian names as well. Indeed, we had 194 Eurasian-only names. This was followed by the African-only names coming from one language and culture. However, the one we want to focus on is the one that transcends ethnic and neocolonial nation-state boundaries. In comparison to what was only 3 individuals in the case of IAS, as shown in Table 1 and Figure 1, we find a total of 94 for Abibitumi Casa. It should be noted that we have the details of 473 collated, but again, this pattern is the one that we want to focus on. And here you can see the data in table form, right? Things that I just read, like the 3, right? The total of 270. You can see those here. So we don't need to focus on these too much, right? We can just continue to read. This pattern is the one that we want to focus on, as these types of names go beyond the boundary of the country and the cultural linguistic group, as was atypical of the largely continental African IAS constituency. As may perhaps be expected, Eurasian-only names were in the majority, but tied for second were the 94 names that were African, but which came from different cultures, languages, and ethnic groups. However, even in the Abibitumi Casa data, we found that one may have a name like Afia Mafawa, which derives exclusively from the Akan ethnicity of Ghana. In the case of the African-only names coming from different ethnic backgrounds, you can find examples like Sedem Aloti, thus Sedem is Iwe, and Aloti is Ga. Then there are those who have African-only names, different ethnic and different countries. And given the comparatively large number, we can say that for those with any type of African Black consciousness, such as a naming pattern could be said to be very typical in the diaspora. An example is the name Ama Osset. Ama coming from the ancient Nile Valley Kemet, and Osset coming from the ancient Nile Valley Kemet, and Ama coming from the Akan of Ghana. Examples of such names appear in Table 3. Then there are not only those with names coming from different African countries, but also those with Eurasian names. An example of which may include a name, Kwabena Shaka Jackson. I actually knew someone named Kwabena. Then there are those with names from Africa and Eurasia, just as in the case of the aforementioned IAS names. The major difference is that in the Abibitumi Casa data, the first name tends to be Afrikaan, while the last name tends to be Eurasian. While in the IAS data, it intended to be the reverse. Okay. Some of these types of names include William Diakite. That's interesting. Or Ugunwali Adetunde Alastair. Then there were also only Eurasian names like John Clay Humperdinck. God damn, that's a white name. John Clay Humperdinck. All right. It is useful at this point to note that in the diaspora context, some have put their African names in parentheses. Oftentimes, this may be done in instances where people would have Eurasian names, but then have African names that they might use on weekends or at events, lectures, and other African-centered occasions. By the way, for you guys who are listening live to me, right? 2 things. Make sure to hit the like button if you're here. I see we have more viewers than likes. So make sure you guys hit the like button. right? But number two, how many of you have a go-to African name? Just out of curiosity, how many of you have a go-to African name? I've met a lot of folks like that at different political organization functions and stuff like that. But how many of you have an actual go-to African name? And by the way, no one ever answered if they would change their surname from being a Eurasian name to a simple X, as in the case of Malcolm X, right? It is useful at this point to note that in the diaspora context, some have put their African names in parentheses. Oftentimes this may be done in instances where people have Eurasian names but then have African names that they might use on weekends or at events, lectures, and or African-centered occasions. This contributes to a type of schizophrenia, euphemistically called double consciousness, whereby the person has an ostensibly African name and or personality when operating in an African black environment while maintaining a Eurasian white name elsewhere. This type of schizophrenia is also seen in the case of what in Akan is called the Faidin, or the house name, which, as the name intimates, is what is used in the house while one assumes different, typically Eurasian school name, but in the public sphere. We will return to this point in our conclusion section. So what were the findings? In terms of findings, there were a few gray areas where it was not entirely clear with regard to how to categorize names. For example, my middle name is Bakari, and my parents picked it from a name book where it was identified as a Kiswahili name. When they learned the name Abu Bakr, they thought the Kiswahili name was derived from Arabic. However, in the works of Sheikh Anta Diop and Cook, 1989, the authors actually showed how Bakari was an actual name of the last ruler of a united Kemet, land or nation of black people, and Kush of the so-called 25th dynasty, as can be seen in figure 3. And this is how the Arabs even got the name in the first place. Interesting. I always thought I always thought Bakari was a purely Arab name, right? This is a pertinent discussion to avoid the conundrum of painting ourselves into the proverbial corner along the lines of, quote, what they steal of ours is theirs, and what's theirs is theirs, end of quote. At the end of the day, if we relinquish something because Eurasians have appropriated it, it is very possible that we could eventually end up with nothing at all, as they have demonstrated a proclivity for theft over the past few thousand years. So this brings us to a section called Patterns of Names of the Diaspora and Continent. In the chat room, KW Don 7 says, I would give my descendants an African surname. I appreciate that, KW Don 7. Right? He would give an African surname as opposed to, I guess, the X. That's neat. And I think he said earlier that he would give them an African first name too, if I'm not mistaken. So patterns of names of the diaspora and continent. Thus, in our findings, we observe that in the case of names from Abibitumi Casa, pulling largely from the diaspora, African black individuals tend to have names from all over the African world, whereby the first name may be from one cultural linguistic group, while the surname is from another in different countries. However, there also may be a disparity whereby a preferred African or black name, or what we may term a weekend name, may be different from one's legal name, which may still be Eurasian. It should be noted, however, that this phenomenon is not exclusive to those of the diaspora, and the exact same phenomenon might be found for continental Africans as well. In the case of IAS, we find that names tend to be either from neo-colonial enemies, a single African cultural linguistic group within neo-colonial boundaries, or a mixture of these two. Also, similar to the phenomenon of weekend names is that of the home names, as we find in Ghana, whereby a person may have an African name that they use in the household among family, while they may have a Eurasian name that they may use everywhere else. Also of note is that whereas oftentimes when there is a mix between African or black names and Eurasian names in the diaspora, it tends to be a situation of African or black first name, Eurasian last name. While on the continent, by and large, it is a situation of Eurasian first name, African or black last name. As far as the Abibitumi Casa data are concerned, the differentiating factor between that and the IAS data, however, is the significant presence of names that cut across cultural, linguistic, ethnic country lines. This factor is in large part the difference between intentionality and circumstances. By the way, the Chinese tend to have an Anglo name, you know, when their name is really like ping tong, ging gong ging, and they're called Stephen, right? So that's not uncommon with some other groups too, but we're not concerned with what they do. KW7 says the X thing is NOI. That's absolutely correct. That's an NOI thing, right? Generally speaking, on the continent, did I read this already? There is a tendency towards naming as a marker of history. For example, under the so-called pre-colonial, colonial, and neo-colonial paradigm, wherein the African's entire historical perspective is focused on the African encounter with whites. In terms of circumstances, this is a scenario whereby a name is given on the basis of the idea that a name should be given because it is one's grandfather's name, or because it comes from one's particular cultural, linguistic, historical circumstances, or because one was born within particular boundaries. There is a pertinent quote from Farrakhan wherein he states that, quote, "He who gives you the diameter of your knowledge prescribes the circumference of your activity." That was by Muhammad in 2012, speaking of the NOI. A related quote from Nana Kwa David Whitaker states that, quote, "What you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself." That's nothing but a word right there. Put that on a t-shirt, underdog. Right? I like it. That is to say, one can only act upon that to which one has had exposure and access. This is relevant because we find that oftentimes, particularly on the continent, one tends to have exposure to the naming systems of one's own cultural linguistic group and those of one's colonial enemies, and these are the only resources that one may feel he or she has a right to or even know about. This is what I refer to as the backward-forward paradigm. This is the false paradigm. Hold on. This is the false paradigm referred to as the tradition versus modernity conundrum, whereby we look back to the village or town, city of one's origin and forward to the United Kingdom, France, or Portugal without looking around at other African people. Well said. However, in the diaspora, there seems to be more of a tendency towards a circular relational view, whereby one looks around and selects from any and all of that which is African or black. If the name is African, then one may come from Zimbabwe, Somalia, Senegal, with considerations of evaluative criteria including Africanness, meaning, sound, location, ethnic group, spirituality, origin, benefit, KWK. I forgot what KWK stands for. Someone remind me what KWK, I know it's like an African equivalent to etc. But the KWK also stands for something, just like etc. ETC stands for etc. What does the KWK stand for? Someone post that in the chat room if you know, or if you can quickly look it up for me. Thus, we find the majority of African names where they appear in the Abibitumi Casa data are those that were selected intentionally and which can be considered as a marker of conscientious and intentional Pan-African consciousness. Thus, overall, the names found at IAS tended to be that of the backward forward paradigm, and that of Abibitumi Casa tended toward a more circular relational paradigm. That leads to a fundamental question. Are continental Africans really just messing up? And Africans in the diaspora are more progressive? Or is it that Africans in the diaspora are more sentimental? To continue. That is to say, those with any African names whatsoever seem to be employing a set of evaluative criteria related to, but not entirely the same as that articulated by Obeng in 2001. Interestingly, oftentimes, with the name bearer selecting his or her own name in the Abibitumi Casa data. As mentioned, it is important to note that the evaluative criteria of the diaspora Africans who have African names from multiple cultural, linguistic, ethnic groups may include considerations related to Africanness, meaning sound, location, cultural, linguistic group, spirituality, origin, and DNA testing. However, it is important to keep in mind that these are trends and not hard and fast rules, because there are continental Africans with names like Seku, right, which is Fula, Arabic, Guinea, Conakry, and Nkrumah, which is Nzema or Ghana, as well as diaspora African names like Nana Akua, which is Akan or Ghanaian only. Right. Out of the aforementioned evaluative criteria for those of the diaspora with names from one cultural linguistic group, this tends to be a result of initiation into an African spiritual system such as Akan, Yoruba, Kemetic, or due to DNA testing. Africans who take or receive such names may, however, be running back to the fragments that led to the situation in which we find ourselves. That is to say, rather than seeing ourselves as African, black people with common Eurasian, white, non-black enemies, Asante people may raid the Akiem. The Akiem may displace the Akwamu. The Akwamu may enslave the Akuapem people, the Oyo may enslave the Ijebu, and so forth and so on. And running back to these fragments, it becomes difficult to collectively defend ourselves against a type of race-first coordination seen clearly at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, in which whites came together to subjugate all African black people, regardless of their ethnonyms or self-identification. They're making a good point here. Let's see if they nail the point or not. This is why, in our view, it is quite anachronistic to say, quote, Africans enslave Africans, right? In that those who now retroactively identify as African or black people involved in enslavement did not identify as Africans or black people themselves. Indeed, if they did have such a broad identity in which we saw our neighbors as the same as ourselves, such an outlook may have lent itself to a greater degree of inter-ethnic coordination and coming together to fight our collective white enemies on the basis of what we have in common. I think they stuck the landing. Do you guys get what I'm talking about when I say they stuck the landing? I think they stuck the landings pretty well here. Right? Unfortunately, to this day, that type of we're all black people worldview tends to be found in the diaspora among those with any significant level of African black consciousness, more than on the continent, as we see in names given and received. Indeed, for many continental Africans, It may seem odd or curious for an African black person to have a name outside of one's ethnic group. In fact, I, first author, so that would be Obadeli Kambon, have been asked by continental Africans with names like Eric, Eunice, and John whether or not I am ethnically Yoruba. When I tell them the circumstances of my parents giving me the name Obadeli, I have had many cases where they do not believe me or perhaps think I am ashamed of my supposed Yoruba ancestry. However, they have Eurasian names without me assuming that they must be Nordic, British, or whatever else. This is to say, these guys like to use this term, this is to say, but this is to say, it tends to not even occur to many here in Ghana as even the remotest of possibilities that an African can have a name on the basis of Pan-African consciousness, instead of simply due to one's cultural, linguistic affiliation. Because this idea does not even occur as a possibility. It seems to be far from reality to expect this to be a widespread practice here in Ghana specifically, or on the continent in general. In other words, while the circular relational African black worldview is often due to African names being forcibly stripped from Africans of the diaspora, this has led to a Pan-African consciousness whereby those with any appreciable level of consciousness beyond that created and fostered by white-induced miseducation see ourselves as connected with other African black people by default. Due to this, the tendency is to see any African or black names as our names. On the continent, the dominant tradition tends to only see names of one's ethnic group and that of one's colonial enemy as fair game. Ain't that a trip? That's why I say they nailed the landing here. Isn't that something? Interestingly, this naming tradition of the diaspora, wherein one applies the circular relational paradigm, is lampooned in Osiris Rising by Atta, Ai, Kwe, Arma, ironically with a royal name from one fragmented ethnic group within a single Berlin Conference created fragment, wherein the villain Ras Sinke, Jomo Equano, has names from all over the continent, but is portrayed as a veritable buffoon, while Asur and Ast, with solely Kemetic names, are presented as level-headed and respectable. That reminds me, when we talk about the writing prompts in the creative corner on the Discord, that's something I want you guys to keep in mind. Remember what we're doing in those writing sessions. We're writing work that represents us globally, represents us as Africans. It Sankofa, it goes back to the continent. So when you name folks in your stories, don't do the thing like the next section of this paper seems to be pointing to. Don't just make up a name with a kind of an African syllable structure, right? Like, do your work and give the characters names that reflect their destiny in the story that you're telling. And that goes for curriculum as well. In curriculum, if you have a math problem, a word problem, so and such does something, give them an African name. A name that's fitting to the subject and the destiny of that character in the text, right? So keep those things in mind. I'm going to hit this next section, ghetto names with African syllable structure, right after a quick station ID break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure you guys check out the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Those that I just mentioned in those spots, as well as the Queen's Council podcast. Make sure you check those out. Hopefully you guys enjoy the reading, the paper itself. If you enjoy the paper, type 1 in the chat. If you enjoy the reading, the paper, type 1 in the chat. Or if you're watching the Nets and the Celtics, well, you probably won't be able to hear me, but type 2 in the chat. If that's what you prefer, you can type 2 in the chat. Speaking of that, in case some of you are wondering what's going on, it seems like, maybe that game, I can't tell. I was trying to see what the score was, just so y'all would know, but I can't pull it up right now. Jerry Wallace says type 1, so he's enjoying the conversation. I appreciate that. I guess the other folks are watching the game right now, so let's get through it. Ghetto names with African syllable structure. At this juncture, we will also briefly examine what are usually referred to as quote-unquote ghetto names in places like the United States, including, but not limited to, the names given in Table 4, right? So let's see what Table 4 says. Table 4 has Anika, which is a Vai name, meaning she is very beautiful. Anita, which is Yoruba, complete possession. I have a cousin whose middle name is Anita, right? Complete possession or ownership. Aliyah is a fawn name for staircase. Amanda is a Zulu name, okay. And a Xhosa name, meaning power, okay. Amanda Seals. Aya is a Yoruba name for wife, or Khan, or India Khan is known as fern, so it means fern. Goober, which is Nguba. The word goober, we should know that by now, which is funny. These Europeans, man, they stole that shit, turned that into a whole company and started selling peanut butter at one time, right? Peanut butter and jelly. Goober means peanut or groundnut, right? Often used for boys with peanut-shaped heads. Lulu is a Kakongo name, meaning bitter leaf. In Mandinka, it means 5. Tamika is also Kakongo, meaning measure. Interesting. Tanisha. Wow, I never knew Tanisha was an African name. Tanisha is a Hausa name, born on Monday. Tanash, I knew someone back in high school named Tanash, is Shoshona. It means the creator is with us. Wanda is also a Kakongo name. Wow, you learned some stuff, which means a net or to strike. Yaya is also Kakongo, meaning honorific title, respectful, appellation addressed to a person, usually women. Zendaya. You guys know Zendaya, currently in those Spider-Man films, and what's the other film she did with Denzel's son, Malcolm and Marie or something like that? Zendaya. It's a Shoshona name, meaning give thanks. Zola is a Zulu name, meaning quiet or tranquil. Zuri is a Kiswahili name, meaning good and beautiful. Interesting. That's why I like reading these papers, man. These papers gives you a quicker amount of access to information, right? If you had to go and read through a book of names and all that stuff, you would have to do a lot of reading to get, those little gems that I just read just now. As we can see, a whole host of these names are derived directly from African languages, which overwhelmingly exhibit open syllable structures, or predominantly 3 types, as shown in Figure 4. The preponderance of African languages have simple to moderately complex syllable structure, and so-called ghetto names follow this morphological affinity. In the figure, the white dots indicate a simple syllable structure, right? The pink dots signify a moderately complex syllable structure, while the red dots indicate a complex syllable structure, right? By far, the first two types of syllable structures are the predominant ones, while the third, complex syllable structure, is more typical of places under Eurasian, Arab, linguistic hegemony. Because of the influence of the first two types of the continent, it becomes clear that this is also the preferred type of syllable structure among African or blacks in the diaspora. In other words, there is, take a drink every time you hear "in other words." In other words, there is an adherence of African black people throughout the global African world to these original African syllabic paradigms, especially in nicknames, but also in proper names termed ghetto. What is remarkable about such names, especially nicknames, is that even without direct knowledge of continental African languages, as shown in Figure 4, phonological structures of these so-called ghetto names parallel the types of structures that are preferred in the place where humanity and human language came about first, Africa. These are the structures that we can say are prototypically human, i.e. non-Neanderthal. And given that African black people invented language itself, it follows that we should have some say in the matter with regard to what syllable structures should look like, whether found in Africa or in the diaspora. All right? So this is a map of the simple to complex syllable structures that you find across the continent. Notice that Obadeli, again, if you go back to the interview I had with Obadeli, one of the things he talked about in the interview was the fact that the globe and the maps that were given are false. And the idea that the reality is the world is actually upside down. So what we think is north is actually south, and south is north, right? And that the reason it was done that way was to confuse you, as well as to make you think, because the way the map or the globe is currently constructed, it has Europe over Africa. Europe is more north to Africa. So it's to say that the European is above the African, right? But notice here, right, being consistent with his ideology and his teaching, he puts the African continent, the map of the African continent, upside down as compared to what we've been taught in schools, right? Just wanted to point that out. That brings us to a section called Significance of Naming Patterns and Understanding the State of Pan-Africanism. We argue that tendencies of the continent and the diaspora, as represented by these two African black institutions, may serve as one of various indicators for understanding the current state of Pan-Africanism. Although these are tendencies, we must take other factors into account, such as the phenomenon of house names found in places like Ghana and the conscious weekend names found in the diaspora. At this juncture, it is also very important to note that these types of names are merely taken to be possible indicators of one's level of Pan-African consciousness and the way that such consciousness takes form through tangible behavioral practices of naming. However, these names are not taken to be predictors, which is to say, take a drink on that too, just because one has names from Senegal and South Africa, or a name like Chimwido, which is a Shoshone name, or Jeremiah, right? This does not mean that one is an authentic Pan-Africanist, but may rather be a pro-Arab, anti-African, anti-black, Marxist, continentalist who holds no allegiance to indigenous African black people whatsoever. Yeah, that's true. But that also calls into question, what's the point of the study? Now, maybe later on they're going to link this to the notion that, which is what I've been pushing, start using more African names. Because the African name, not only for its meaning and for its destiny, but the African name also will guide people back to the continent, right? If Kwame Brown's people who named him, if they were conscious, because they could be a part of this last group that I have highlighted here. If they were actually conscious folks, right, or Pan-African at that, right, he wouldn't be out here talking the foolishness that he's talking. Or maybe they were, and he's developed his own mindset. But it's hard to go away from your name. So it leads me to believe that they didn't really give him the instructions or explain to him what was the purpose of his name, right? To continue. Such persons may decide to be sellouts, Kwame Brown, and always take the side of their white ideological or bigenetic parents anytime there's an African or black issue, right? Because there's something Kwame Brown said in that video too that I didn't talk about, and I don't plan to get too deep into, but he said that his people helped to build this country, when in reality your people were forced to build this country. You and a white guy weren't sitting side by side as buddies picking cotton or laying the railroad in the Northeast and Midwest until the Asians came and were hired to continue it down to the West. Y'all weren't friends doing that shit. Y'all weren't taking lunch breaks and comparing what lunch you have. You were forced under the threat of violence and death. So even that notion that you helped to build this country is false. But it's a notion that a lot of Africans in America have. So again, taking on or bearing such circular relational Pan-African names is not expected to be a fail-safe predictor of the state of Pan-Africanism in general on an individual or collective level, but merely a possible indicator that this thought to be indicative of a Pan-African black worldview through embodied or overt behavioral practices, right? I'm pushing, do it to connect yourself back to the continent, connect your children, your people, etc., right? This brings us to a section. I did say this paper is long, and it is a long paper. This brings us to a section called Selective Purity and quote-unquote mixture, coffee with or without cream. Another important point is that in our view, if you are African or black, then African black names belong to you regardless of location, ethnic group, culture, language, or time period. That's an important point. You could choose your name from wherever you want to on the continent. It's your name. It's your words. Such a broader consciousness, which we coin here as black people in the front consciousness, transcends ethnic fragment consciousness, or to be content under the heel of our white Eurasian enemy colonial consciousness, or neo-colonial consciousness, or national consciousness, or Afropean, Afropolitan consciousness, or worship imaginary Eurasian gods of our enemy conquerors in the form of Christianity and Islam consciousness. All of these may be understood as different manifestations of fragment consciousness that Tata Obenga in 2018 referred to as tribal consciousness. This type of fragment consciousness can be seen clearly in Ghana when you greet people in Asante Twi, the indigenous language with the greatest number of speakers within these particular neo-colonial boundaries, and the person may tell you, that's not my language. However, this declaration is invariably stated in English. which is definitely not their language. God damn, we are in trouble. This is an example of how we may have strict boundaries when it comes to other African black people, but we have very permeable, perhaps even non-existent boundaries when it comes to Eurasian culture. This is what I call the coffee with cream analogy, as exemplified in Figure 5, according to Nana Malcolm X. Quote, if it's just like when you've got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What do? You integrate it with cream. You make it weak. But if you pour too much cream in it, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot. It becomes cool. It used to be strong. It becomes weak. It used to wake you up. Now it puts you to sleep. It's Malcolm X in 1963. I always love those words right there, man. I always love those words right there. However, it is a more Pan-African situation when the white cream is kept out, and rather the African black people come out of their white borders and begin to take on names from another metaphorical cup as their own, shown in Figure 6. Right? So, one of the things I like about Obadeli Kambon is the brashness, right? And we all should strive to be as brash, all right? This next section is called Cultural Linguistic AIDS. Cultural Linguistic AIDS. Something a lot of African black folks suffer from. Another analogy with regard to anthroponymy on the continent and the diaspora relates to what we term cultural linguistic AIDS, where a culture's immune system is so broken down that anything Eurasian, particularly Eurasian names in this instance, can come in. The difference on the continent, however, tends to be that although Eurasian names are able to penetrate, rigid borders are maintained with regard to other African black names. As illustrated in Figure 7 and 8, white Eurasian cultural linguistic AIDS breaks down one's culture, but only selectively in that it allows white names to penetrate individual cultures. Yet it does not allow African names from elsewhere in the African world to do so, as shown in Figure 9. That is a great point. So you guys are on the continent, gladly naming yourself Arthur, right? You're a Khan, and you're gladly naming yourself Arthur, but you wouldn't dare take up a Yoruba name. Imagine that. You're African on the continent, you're part of the Akan people, but your name is Arthur. Someone comes to you and say, yo, why don't you take up the name, some Yoruba name? No, that's not my language. That's not my that's stupid. This analogy is made by Mama Marimba Ani, who argues that culture is a means by which a people protects themselves. We can understand culture as the immune system of a people. Culture is that immune system, right? The virus is the Urugu virus. That results in a condition of cultural AIDS. Don't sleep on how they use words here. This is how we should be using words ourselves. Right? In this picture, they show you how AIDS takes over, right? And this is how AIDS takes over the body, right? And this is not dissimilar from how this cultural linguistic AIDS takes over the body of Africans in different countries or localities, and it breaks us down. The Urugu virus. This begs the question of how a continental African from a specific cultural linguistic group and/or who was colonized by a particular Eurasian country overwhelmingly tends to have names reflective of these circumstances rather than a name expressive of an understanding that whatever is African belongs to him or her. We argue that this state of affairs may be indicative of the current state of Pan-Africanism, whereby there is a tendency toward the backward-forward paradigm on the continent and the more circular relational paradigm in the diaspora. Right? He's going to talk about the GMA, not the GMO, not the genetically modified organism. He's going to talk about the genetically modified African in a second. Indeed, even in the context of a Urugu-induced cultural linguistic AIDS, where any white Eurasian names can infiltrate in the IAS data, where the majority of graduates come from Ghana, we do not observe a statistically significant number of individuals with names from Ghana and Zimbabwe, or Ghana and Kemet, or Ghana and Mali, for example. Indeed, it appears that many seem to be convinced that the only names that belong to those of us of continental African extraction are those imposed upon us by colonial enemies, or the ethnic group of one's parents. These seem to be names more related to circumstance and self-identification on an ethnic consciousness level, rather than names reflective of one's self-determination as a lived manifestation of one's Pan-African consciousness. However, we must note that adherence to names limited to one's own ethnic group may come from rootedness and connections to one's own cultural, linguistic, ethnic background and specific history. Because oftentimes Africans or Black people of the diaspora have had these types of links forcibly severed, that apparent weakness is at the same time a strength when it comes to seeing ourselves as connected to a greater Pan-African or Black whole. Indeed, based on the data at hand, it seems that these ties that bind on the continent may have actually served as hurdles to Pan-African naming practices that go beyond colonial borders or ethnic affiliation. At the same time, we must factor in the idea that names are not entirely arbitrary, and again, one can only select from what one is exposed to and or has meaning to that person. In such a context, passing on a name simply because of its meaning and the fact that it is African may seem unconscionable to those committed to keeping their family, clan, ethnic ties strong. Another compounding factor is that oftentimes a newborn child in the African Black context is seen as a returned ancestor who, once identified as such, will retain the name that he or she had in his or her previous incarnation. According to Nana Kamalu, quote, the occasion of birth in Africa is seen as a transition from the spiritual into the physical realm. The spiritual marking of the early stages of transition in the life of a person therefore serves to emphasize the process of breaking away from the world of the unborn. The naming ceremony is the first of these, and the idea that the unborn come from the ancestors is shown by the fact of the newborn being named after the ancestors. Nana Kamalu in 1998 further states that, quote, in ancient Egyptian tradition, as in traditional Africa, a person's name dies if he dies without offspring. So the name must be remembered in order for the person to live on. As such, the name that the child will bear is not seen as a matter of expression of one's Pan-African consciousness or lack thereof, but is related to the worldview and is interpreted as operating on the spiritual plane. According to Tata Fu Kiau, worth quoting at length, quote, the mother's name can only be used as a formal name by daughters of her daughters, for as long as the name is remembered throughout the branching or ramification of the clan. This naming process through generations is called Indukulu or Intombodolo, respectively, of the verbs Luka and Tombula, making alive one's root ancestors by name. The process involves formalities, ceremonies, rituals, taboos, dance, and teachings. The bearer of such a name of Indukulu is the Indusi, i.e. the made alive by name or the root ancestor living in the community within a young body. From his childhood, an Indusi, the made alive, has all formal and legal relationships within the community, respect, honor, and address due to the root ancestor whose name he or she bears. Again, like I said, I've seen this carried on, but unfortunately, it was carried on with Yoruba names. But underneath the Yoruba name was the same African concept. Revolutionary matron is still here. Revolutionary matron says you can traumatize a person so much that they begin to form an interdependent trauma bond with their oppressor. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? When you beat, when you whip, what's your boy name again? Damn it, why am I drawing a blanket? When you whip Kunta Kinte and make him say his name is Toby, he's probably going to have a Toby Jr. in the future. I don't remember what happened in Roots with that, but chances are, right, in reality, if you whip a Kunta Kinte, he's going to have a Toby Jr. in his future. That's an interdependent trauma bond, right? It's a shame. This is the worldview that is at the root of the so-called title names, translating typically as king, queen, or ruler, such as Nana, Na, and Ni, that the births and deaths registry of Ghana attempted to ban in Ghana. Ironically, the births and deaths registry had no such parallel ban on white title names, such as Richard, which means dominant ruler, Henry, state ruler, Harry, a state ruler, Walter, army ruler, and Malik, king. Although it is likely that the births and deaths registry did not even know the meaning of the white Eurasian names that they accept without question. Hold on. Without question, such a policy speaks volumes about the disconnection that has taken place where someone may be African black biogenetically and phenotypically, but thoroughly drained of African black content, and therefore due to Yoruba-induced cultural linguistic aids. To be clear about something before I continue here, listen, if your parents weren't conscious, if your parents didn't have African consciousness, which is somewhat likely, if your parents and grandparents didn't have it, you're gonna have a Yoruba name. That's just what it is. The question is, though, fortunately I have a African name. The question is, though, are you going to continue the tradition? Having the knowledge that you have, will you continue the tradition of transmitting this cultural linguistic aids to your future generations? To return to the above quote, pertinent to both the IAS and the Abibitumi Casa data, is the African black worldview in which a root ancestor is made alive through their name. This brings up an extremely problematic situation with regard to the giving or bearing damn it, of Eurasian white names, whereby un-African and anti-African white enemies are made alive within a young African black body. You know, I hadn't even considered that during this reading. I had not considered that during this reading, but that's an excellent point. If you accept what I've read so far, you have to accept that too. The extremely problematic situation with regard to the giving or bearing of Eurasian white names, whereby un-African, anti-African white enemies are quote unquote made alive within a young African black body. According to a Kiswahili proverb, quote, if you inherit a name, you must also adopt its affairs. If you inherit a name, you must adopt its affairs. I mean, think about that. Again, go back to roots. Think about what's happening when Kunta Kinte is beaten to give up his African name and take on this bullshit named Toby. You must carry out that name's affairs. I see we got global black African empowerment in the chat room saying Yurugu linguistic aids. Revolutionary Matron says, when we name our children after our enemy, we are always at war with them. Yeah. Think about it. Right? Piece of global black African empowerment. I saw you posted a comment recently on one of the recent episodes I did. And just to let y'all know, I actually screen captured it. I saw it on my phone first. When you go to the video, your comment is gone. I was about to say Twitter, but I meant to say YouTube is doing this bullshit censoring thing. The comment that you made didn't have any kind of hate speech or nothing in it, but clearly they're looking at, even though I'm a small channel, they're looking at the channel. Because of the information that's being pushed through on this channel, they're clearly looking at the channel. This is why, as you guys saw some weeks back, we were able to demonstrate between me here and you guys in the chat room that YouTube has been messing with the likes. And I believe they're also messing with the views, because the threshold or the ceiling of views that I have when I talk this type of stuff is always a small number. But if I go and I start talking some entertainment type stuff, some beef with Corey Holcomb and Zoe Williams or something like that, I get good numbers on those videos. I get good numbers. I even get subscriptions on those videos. But for some reason, my regular videos don't have above a certain threshold of views, above a certain threshold of likes. They're monitoring it and they're messing with it. So Global Black African, if you were wondering why I didn't respond to your message in any way, that's the reason why. They took that down. I want y'all to be mindful of that. By the way, if you haven't already, join the Discord. There's a pinned comment at the top and down in the description of the video. There's the link for the Discord. Join the Discord. We're not stopping you from saying what you gotta say. So join the Discord where you can say what it is you gotta say. Right? To continue. Given that it is expected that a name will have an impact on the name bearer, one need not be surprised to find biogenetic Africans engaging in un-African and anti-African behaviors consistent with the white root predecessor. Having such a label, which we can scarcely refer to as a name, applied to one certainly creates a situation of ambivalence, if not outright contradictory, schizophrenic, double consciousness. This phenomenon is also at the root of Africans who do not see themselves as Africans, who are connected to their ancestors throughout the African black world, beyond the confines of the cages mistakenly referred to as countries, or the ethnic fragments referred to as tribes. Additional considerations with regard to naming may relate to the question of, does the name have a meaning in a language that one actually understands, i.e., the language of the African root ancestor, which would be expected on the continent, but perhaps less so in the diaspora. In instances where a white Eurasian root predecessor is involved, it is also the case that many have no idea what their white Eurasian names mean. They just know that these are white names, sometimes referred to euphemistically as Christian or Muslim names. Such names are about as far away as one can get in relation to the 3 R's that we talked about earlier with regard to Pan-African naming practices. It should be noted, however, that in Africa, the meaning of archaic names may be obscure to native speakers. In Yoruba, names like Amu, Abeo, Akano, Aleo, Ajeo, and Ayano are morphosemantically opaque, with different Yoruba authors proposing a variety of meanings. Similarly, Akan names such as Barago, which interestingly is a name also given in Senegal, right? For example, Barago Jope, Antwi, Agei, Ajay, right? Korama, Kakari, Gamfi, Gamfua, and others have evoked a wide range of folk etymological interpretations due to morpho-semantic opacity, while for others, Obeng simply glosses some of these as proper name. In such cases, the origin may actually be an earlier stage of the language, in which the constituent parts still had transparent semantic content, or from an entirely different language brought by migrants who have joined the cultural linguistic group. If the latter is the case, the facts of that origin may be unknown to the name givers or name bearers, and thus may still lack the intentionality expected for an expression of Pan-African consciousness. In naming, there is a consideration of the history with which one connects and identifies. As demonstrated in the data, this may be the pre-colonial or colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial paradigm, which Eurasia centrically focused one's entire historical existence around one's interactions with whites from Western Eurasia, rather than a circular relational one based on identification with a common African black collective with one creator, one aim, one ancestry, and one destiny. All right? In other words, take a drink. Even for those, let me take a drink, because my throat is all messed up. In other words, for those who pay lip service to the idea of identifying with the African black people, there may be scanty evidence of that supposed belief when it comes to the decision of what one will name one's children. In fact, ironically, many may perceive giving a name from another ethnic group as a case of appropriation, although apparently not so for names like Esther, Roland, John, Paul, Eunice, Priscilla, Joyce, Muhammad, Ibrahim, etc. What does it tell us about the state of Pan-Africanism when one is hesitant to identify one's child with one's racial relatives, yet happily identifies him or her with one's historical, current, and future white enemies? If, indeed, identifying with one's African black racial relatives, i.e. the original concept of Pan-Africanism, is seen as appropriation, this is illogical. If one actually identifies as African black, as if you are truly African black yourself, you cannot appropriate that which is your own any more than one can appropriate one's own eyeballs or head. By the way, you Africans from the continent need to get this understanding too. You need to get this understanding too. However, if one identifies with a fragment, i.e. Akan, Yoruba, Wolof, African, or African American, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Cuban, Ghanaian, Nigerian, and South African, then that primary identity would necessarily lead one to think that giving a name other than that which is historically associated with one's fragment is a case of appropriation. This is the fallacy of fragment consciousness, in that we can see clearly that those who suffer from it are more likely to identify with their white Eurasian enemies than they are to identify with their brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles, their African black racial relatives, a good potential indicator about this current state of Pan-Africanism. So this brings us to the conclusion. I just want to touch on that last point. Again, this is the Kwame Brown problem, right? The problem is that one way or the other, he was given a double consciousness, in that he was told he was African and American. And ultimately, when that happens, folks tend to identify with the Eurasian part, right? So he doesn't identify with the African part. He identifies with the Eurasian part, the American part, right? So when I was reading this, I knew I butchered some of the pronunciations. Global Black African Empowerment is here to correct me on the pronunciations, and I appreciate that. I do. I appreciate it, and it's something that I intend to start to study a little closer going forward. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we should adopt an African language. Each one of us should adopt, maybe we adopt a more central language like Kiswahili or something, but we should adopt an African language, because clearly the pronunciations in the Anglophile tongue is off, right? It's off. So Global Black African Empowerment says connection to African affairs is literally a threat to national security. Memorandum 46. Revolutionary Matron says that Global Black African Empowerment, absolute facts. Global Black African Empowerment says Amos Wilson said African identity is literally a threat to the elites. Check out Henry Kissinger report. I thought to read that one of the Kissinger reports. I think you're talking about the same one. I thought to read that on the show. I might do that in the future. Global Black African corrects me in my pronunciation. GY equals G Kai, which equals Chai High, I guess, which equals Shy in Akan Twi linguistics. That's something, again, I gotta get better at that, and hopefully I can in the future. Hopefully a person like Global Black African Empowerment can help with that. He says to Revolutionary Matron, I sent a letter to the Pentagon about why African empowerment is dangerous and a threat. Got crickets. Judgment on the way. Right? Revolutionary Matron says black is global. Revolutionary Matron also says trying to assert that black is anything other than global allows people to put their intersectional issues ahead of the camaraderie we should have as a black family. That I agree with. And that's what Obadeli, Kambon, and them are talking about. Right? And continental Africans need to get that through their, I mean, we all do, don't get me wrong. But continental Africans need to get that thing out of their head that, you know, you hear Caribbean music or something, you say, well, this is not African. Stop that bullshit. You know damn well it's derived from the continent, from West Africa in particular. Stop it. Right? And when you come across folks who are, say, American or Caribbean and their name is an African name, don't start talking shit to them about why is it your parents gave you that name. Accept it and move on. Revolution Matron said there's nothing you can do to overcome black. We must recognize we are one people. Absolutely. So let's finish up this paper. I've been here for 2 hours now. Let's finish it up and see if they really fully stick the landing. But I think Kambon and them really stuck the landing. And as a matter of fact, I think I might reach out to Obadeli, because if you heard the interview I did with him months ago, the sound was messed up. I mean, you could make out the conversation. The sound is a little bit, you know, a little bit of a thing, you know, problematic. But I might have him on to discuss, not this paper exactly, but to discuss the concept of naming and phonetics and linguistics, right? I might have him on to discuss, I might reach out to him to discuss that, you know? I think that will do us some good. So let's finish it up. Conclusion. This exploratory study has addressed a topic in onomastics anthroponymy, which has not received significant attention in the literature. That is, a comparative analysis of contemporary naming patterns of the continent and diaspora. Although relying on institutional data, future studies could approach the subject from a different methodological angle in terms of conducting qualitative interviews to get the views of subjects on the names that they bear and give, and how these names relate to professed ideas of Pan-Africanism that they may hold. Furthermore, in terms of institutional data, other institutions can be incorporated in future studies, including overtly Pan-African organizations of the continent and the diaspora, including but not limited to Afrocentricity International, AI, which is my man, what's my man's name again? Omawali. Omawali is involved with that group. I interviewed the sister Wahida about that group. So that's interesting that he mentions that group by name. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, Gavi. The All African People's Revolutionary Party, AAPRP, and Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, PAC or PAC, and so on. In conclusion, we return to the idea that thinking and consciousness may be embodied in one's life choices or decisions, including but not limited to the practice of African, Black, and or un-African, un-Black, and or even anti-African, anti-Black naming traditions. Indeed, there may be a direct correlation between one's consciousness, whether Pan-African, Black consciousness, or fragment, cultural linguistic aids consciousness, and so on, and one's behavior. In the former, the 3 R's of relate, relative, and relevant may be employed as evaluative criteria in one's determination of how a name relates to, is relative to, and is relevant to Pan-Africanism in terms of content, form, and meaning. In the latter, other other considerations, including some of those outlined in Obeng 2001 typology, relating to one's birth circumstances and the like, may be in play. In the case of the first author, which is Obadeli Kambon, in the naming of his children, there was an intentional decision not to be limited to a name from one ethnic, cultural, linguistic group due to considerations of Pan-Africanism. As such, the names of the first author's children whose photo can be seen in figure 10, Ama, which is a Twi name, Oyanko Pombo, also Twi, Ajag Beyala, Yoruba, and of course I might be butchering these names. Global Black African Empowerment, so forgive me. Dia Caesar, which is Kakongo, Dia Silwa, which is also Kakongo, and Polo Lunungu, which is Kakongo. By the way, Obadel has a lot of children, right? And I think when I spoke to him, he had another one recently born or on the way, right? Esan Ki Yigby, again, I know I'm butchering it, forgive me, right? And then Kambon, right? And that's some of his children right there, right? The names given to these, wait a minute. There's more names, apparently. The names given to these children were due to an intentional embodied Pan-Africanism in practice, drawing from various African Black naming traditions. We begin this article with a quote that said, look, your name will exist forever in the temple of the nature. Given what we now know about the whitewashing of Kemet, which means land of black people, a place where the black people referred to themselves as black people and had African black names, it is a distinct possibility that those Africans who do not even have African black names will be lost to history. Because hundreds or thousands of years down the line, someone will be able to look at a census and say that based on the name bearer must certainly have been a white man or woman. You know, that may sound silly to some people. That absolutely makes sense to them. Listen, we've seen already a film or an attempted film. Did I see it? Or maybe it was an attempted episode of a show or something, where they had Michael Jackson played by a white guy. That literally happened. And there was some outcry about it. Michael Jackson was played by a white guy. I forget his name. He's from, I think he was in Saw, right? Played by a white dude. And with the name Michael Jackson, let's be honest, 1,000 years from now, right? And of course, with what Mike did to cover up his vitiligo, right? Folks might straight up just say Mike is a white boy, the greatest entertainer to ever live. We have many generations that may be lost in the future due to mislabeling and misidentification with one's enemies rather than with one's African black racial relatives. These guys come playing music right outside my window. Okay. We should recall the proverb, quote, if you inherit a name, you must also adopt its affairs. End of quote. If Pan-Africanism is not where we would like it to be, it may in part be related to the affairs we have adopted based on the non-African and anti-African names we have inherited. This is why it is important for us to consider the following quote, which entreats us to make our own ancestors' names live, so that in turn, the same will be done for us by our own African black descendants. Quote, let us prepare the bond for the new yam. Let us bear and leave a good name behind for our descendants. End of quote. When this is done, then we will be able to say, look at your name. It will exist forever in the temple of the nature. I thought that was a real good paper. What did you think? Let me take a quick station ID break, the final one. I'll come back. I'll read your comments. What are your thoughts on that paper? What are your thoughts on me linking it to the Kwame Brown foolishness? All right. Let me know I'll discuss it for a little bit on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also check out the Queen's Council, also on KWAZ Radio. In the chat room, there's been some discussions going on. Revolutionary Matron says revisiting the naming ritual and treating it with reverence will add to the racial pride Garvey hoped to achieve. This pattern of naming with meaning is well established in the Bible for those black respectability people. Global Black African Empowerment says Akan Twi should be prioritized given the year of return and West African heritage. Swahili is not our ethnic blood. We have to rename our heroes too, says Global Black African Empowerment. So, Global Black African Empowerment, I realize that Swahili is mixed in with Arabic words and stuff like that, but I understand it. From what I understand, I haven't been to the continent yet, but for what I understand, almost anywhere in the continent, you can find someone who communicates in that language, Kiswahili. And so the only reason why I bring it up is because if it's a language where almost anywhere in the continent you can go and find people to communicate with in that language, it's worthy of our understanding, right? But I get it. You're pushing the same thought that Kambon pushed when I interviewed him, which is learn Twi, because that's the language, of our African heritage. Those of us from the African Diaspora. Right? And so I get that. I get that too. But that's the reason why I mentioned the Swahili or Kiswahili. Only because, like, if I know that I know Kiswahili, then I'm not afraid to go anywhere on the continent. But you're right. If I'm considered, if I'm just considering my West African heritage, then I should learn the Akan Twi. By the way, Global Black African Empowerment. What's a good publication or software to learn Akan Twi from? What's a good publication and or software to learn Akan Twi from? Let me know that. Let me see if you'll answer that before I get off of here. I've been here like almost 2.5 hours. It was a long episode today. It was a long paper. But I do believe it was worth it. I do believe it was worth it. So I'm just waiting to see if Global Black African Empowerment will let me know what's a good book and or software for studying the Akan Twi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly too. By the way, Global, are you on the Discord? Because if you are, then that'll be a good place. If you have resources on the Akan Twi language, that'll be a good place for you to post up any resources you might have in PDF format or whatnot. I'm not hearing from Global Black African, so brother, you could post that comment in the comment section later on if you hear my question. In any event, guys, this has been a good one. I want to thank the people who were here. Global Black African Empowerment was here. Revolutionary Matron was here. Jerry Wallace was here. KW Don 7 was here. I think I said, yeah, I said Revolutionary Matron was here. And so I thank you all for being here. I'll be back with another Shoot the Breeze episode on Saturday. If you want to, head to the Discord, post up the topics you'd like me to discuss, and I will do so on Saturday. Until then, y'all stay safe. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.